For 18 years, Marcus Cole believed his wife had drowned in the black water of Ashford Lake, where a burned-out sedan was pulled from the depths but no body was ever recovered. He built a quiet life out of the wreckage, raising their daughter alone, filling his evenings with engine grease and silence instead of grief he refused to name. Then, on a rain-soaked afternoon at the bus depot, he saw a face he had buried nearly 2 decades earlier. Beside her stood a young man with pale green eyes that matched his own, eyes he had only ever seen in a mirror and in his daughter's face. The woman he had mourned looked at him, trembling, and whispered 5 words that undid everything he thought he understood about his own life. She told him not to say her name because someone was still watching them. If you want to know how a wife the world called dead survived 18 years in silence, stay until the end, because the truth she carries will cost someone everything. Marcus Cole had come to the Ashford Falls bus depot for nothing more complicated than a crate of parts for the 1969 Camaro sitting half-finished in his shop. And he had expected the afternoon to end the way most of his afternoons ended. Grease under his fingernails, the radio playing low while he worked in peace. His life had settled into something manageable over the years. A small restoration garage on the edge of town, a house that still smelled faintly of sawdust, and a daughter named Ivy, who called less often now that she had built a career of her own 2 states away. Marcus had made peace, or something close to it, with the shape his life had taken after the accident that stole his wife from him when Ivy was barely 4 years old. He did not expect the crowd at the depot to part the way it did, or for his eyes to land on a woman standing near the ticket window whose face stopped his breath in his chest. She was older, thinner, and her eyes kept sliding toward the exits the way a person's eyes move when they have spent years learning not to be found. The depot smelled of wet vinyl and diesel, and somewhere behind him a departure board clattered through its rotations, but Marcus barely registered any of it. His whole body narrowed down to the single fact of her face. Marcus told himself it was impossible, that grief could conjure faces out of strangers if a man let it. But the longer he stared, the more certain he became this was not a trick of memory. It was Celeste. His wife, the woman he had married in a church with peeling paint and buried in a coffin the coroner had sworn contained her remains, was standing 30 feet away in a depot full of people who had no idea the ground beneath them had just shifted. Beside her stood a young man, no older than 19, with dark hair and a familiar set to his jaw, and eyes the exact pale green Marcus saw every morning in the mirror, and had seen in his daughter's face since the day she was born. Marcus said her name before he could stop himself, and the sound of it seemed to physically strike her. Celeste flinched, grabbed the young man's arm, and began pulling him toward the far doors before Marcus had taken a full step forward. He caught up to them on the sidewalk outside, rain starting to needle down around them, and demanded to know how a dead woman was standing in front of him breathing. Celeste would not look at him directly, her attention fixed instead on a black SUV idling across the street, its windows tinted dark enough that Marcus couldn't tell if anyone sat inside. She told him, in a voice stripped thin by fear, that they could not be seen together in a place with cameras, and that every second they lingered increased a danger he did not yet understand. When he pressed her for an explanation, she asked only one thing, that he take them somewhere no one would think to look. Before Marcus could answer, the young man turned to Celeste with a question that landed harder than anything else that afternoon. He asked, in a voice caught between hope and disbelief, whether this stranger standing in the rain was truly his father. Marcus drove them to the old storage building behind his garage, a space he used for parts he no longer needed but couldn't bring himself to throw away. For a long moment, none of them spoke while rain drummed against the metal roof. A single bulb overhead buzzed and swayed whenever wind pushed through a gap in the siding, throwing long shadows across shelves crowded with carburetors and coiled hose. The smell of old motor oil settling over the 3 of them like something almost comforting in its ordinariness. Marcus sat on an overturned crate because his legs didn't entirely trust him to stand, studying the 2 people across from him the way he might study an engine that refused to start, searching for the one detail that would explain everything. He couldn't stop looking at the young man, couldn't reconcile the shape of his face with anything he understood about his own history. Yet some old animal instinct refused to dismiss what his eyes kept insisting was true. Celeste finally broke the silence, her hands wrapped tightly around a paper cup of coffee she hadn't touched, and told him that when she vanished 18 years earlier, she had been carrying a child neither of them yet knew existed. Marcus felt something cold move through his chest, because even in the depths of his grief he had never imagined a version of the truth that included a son he'd never been told about. The young man introduced himself as Ren Sterling, though he said the surname carefully, as if it belonged to a costume rather than a name. He explained he had grown up believing his father died before he was born, a story repeated so many times it had calcified into something he never thought to question. Only 2 weeks earlier, his mother had finally told him his father wasn't dead at all, that he was alive and living less than a day's drive from where they'd been hiding. Ren didn't call Marcus anything resembling a father in that first conversation, choosing instead to study him the way a person studies a stranger who happens to share their face, cataloging the similarities without yet trusting what they might mean. Marcus noticed the young man pressed his thumb against the edge of the table when he grew tense, an unconscious habit identical to one he shared with Ivy, and the resemblance rattled him more than any words could have. He told them plainly that 2 decades of lies couldn't be undone by a resemblance, however striking, and that he needed proof before he let himself believe any of it. Celeste agreed without hesitation, but warned him they couldn't send a sample to any ordinary laboratory because Desmond Sterling had people embedded in hospitals, courts, and private data firms across the region. The name hit Marcus like a stone dropped into still water because he remembered it from the earliest days of their marriage, back when Celeste's family had made their disapproval of a small-town mechanic marrying into their world unmistakably clear. He understood then that whatever had pulled his wife back from the dead was not a simple story of a woman running from grief, but something far larger and more dangerous than he had allowed himself to imagine. Before he could ask another question, Celeste reached into her bag and set a photograph on the table between them, its edges worn soft from handling, and showed Marcus walking a 4-year-old Ivy into her first day of preschool. An ordinary morning frozen in time, except the photograph had clearly been taken 10 years after the date on Celeste's death certificate. The story that unfolded that evening carried Marcus back 18 years, to a version of his life he had only ever understood in fragments. Celeste had been born into the Sterling family, daughter of the late Augustine Sterling, founder of Sterling Crown Industries, an empire built across decades of shrewd investment and careful public image. She had never wanted the crown that came with the name, choosing instead to marry a mechanic from a town most of her relatives couldn't locate on a map. She had endured her family's cold disapproval without complaint because Marcus had never once made her feel like a consolation prize. In the early years of their marriage, she used to joke that the Sterling name was a coat she had finally learned to take off, hanging it by the door of their small house and stepping into a life measured in oil changes and grocery lists instead of boardrooms. She had believed, foolishly perhaps, that distance alone would be enough to keep the family's ambitions from ever touching the life she had built for herself. After Augustine died, his younger brother Desmond assumed control of the company, and, with it, control over nearly everything the Sterling name still touched. Celeste had watched her uncle tighten his grip on the family fortune with a patience that unsettled her long before she understood exactly why. 3 days before she disappeared, Celeste discovered Desmond had been siphoning hundreds of millions of dollars out of the company's employee pension fund through a web of shell corporations designed to obscure the trail. Digging further, sleepless and increasingly afraid, she found documents suggesting her own father's signature had been forged across dozens of financial filings in the years before his death. Papers that would have exposed a fraud stretching back further than she dared imagine. She decided to gather every piece of evidence she could find and deliver it to federal investigators, believing naively that the truth alone would be enough to protect her family from her uncle's ambition. Desmond learned of her plan before she could act on it, and his response was not a threat spoken aloud but a manila envelope left on her doorstep containing photographs of Marcus and Ivy taken without her knowledge. Proof that her family knew exactly where to find the people she loved most. Elias Vane, the family's longtime director of security, came to her that same week with an offer that felt less like rescue and more like surrender. He told her that if she wanted her husband and daughter to remain safe, her grief would need to be real in every detail, because Desmond would not be fooled by a staged disappearance if Marcus's mourning ever wavered into something less than genuine. A car resembling Celeste's was pushed into Ashford Lake and set ablaze before sinking, and the dental records used to identify the body recovered from the wreckage had been quietly substituted by someone loyal to the family. Celeste told herself in the earliest days of her exile that she would only need to disappear for a few months, just long enough for Elias to build a case strong enough to protect her when she returned. Those months stretched into years, and the years eventually became 18 she never intended to lose. Marcus asked her, his voice low and controlled in a way that frightened him more than shouting would have, why she never came back once she believed herself safe. Celeste's answer came slowly, each word costing her something. She told him that Elias had once tried to bring her home, arranging the earliest stages of a return that would have reunited her with Marcus and introduced him to the son he never knew he had. Before that plan could move forward, Elias vanished without explanation, and every channel Celeste had used to communicate with the outside world went silent within days of his disappearance. Celeste spent those 18 years moving through a patchwork of borrowed names and rented rooms, first through Nevada, then further north into Idaho, eventually settling for a time near the Canadian border before finally putting down something resembling roots in a small coastal town in Oregon. She learned to live light, keeping a single suitcase packed beneath whatever bed she slept in, learning the particular loneliness of watching other families gather at diner tables on ordinary Sunday mornings while she sat alone with a newspaper. She used more as a shield than a source of news. There were towns where she stayed only weeks and towns where she stayed years, and in every one of them she kept a small photograph of Marcus folded inside a coat pocket, worn soft at the creases from being unfolded too many times in the dark. In the earliest years, Elias had still been able to send her photographs of Marcus and Ivy, proof they remained safe. He each image a small mercy that let her sleep through another night of exile. He had also warned her again and again that Desmond's people had never stopped watching Ashford Falls, waiting patiently for the moment she made a mistake that would confirm what he already suspected. Celeste wrote letters during those years, dozens of them, addressed to a husband who would never receive a single one because she trusted no method of delivery except passing them through Elias, and Elias alone controlled whether they ever left his hands. When Elias disappeared, Celeste was left with no way to know whether he had betrayed her, been discovered by Desmond, or simply been erased the way so many inconvenient people in her family's orbit seemed to disappear. Without a trusted intermediary, she convinced herself that any attempt to reach out would place Marcus and Ivy directly in danger, and so she let the silence continue long after the fear that justified it had curdled into something closer to habit. Marcus listened to all of it without softening, willing to accept an explanation that reduced his daughter's entire childhood to a decision made unilaterally on his behalf. He told her plainly that grief he could forgive, but the theft of his right to know the truth about his own life was a different kind of wound entirely. Wren, who had said little through most of the conversation, finally spoke up with a question of his own, asking his mother whether the same lie had been used to protect both sides of the family from each other. Celeste didn't flinch from the accusation. She admitted that fear alone no longer explained everything, but somewhere in the passing years she had simply lost the ability to imagine what a return might look like, or how she would begin explaining 18 years of absence to a husband and daughter who had already learned to live without her. Marcus asked her more sharply now why she had chosen this particular moment to resurface after so long spent hiding. In answer, Celeste slid a thick folder across the table, its cover embossed with a small silver crest marking every official document belonging to Sterling Crown Industries. Wren would turn 21 years old in exactly 3 days, and that single fact, Celeste explained, carried the power to unravel everything Desmond Sterling had spent nearly 2 decades building. Augustine Sterling, before his death, had structured a trust that held 51% of the voting shares in Sterling Crown Industries, a controlling stake designed to protect the company from exactly the kind of consolidation Desmond had since achieved. Desmond had only ever been granted temporary stewardship of those shares under the condition that Celeste had died without leaving behind a legitimate heir of her own. A hidden clause within the trust, one Desmond believed had died with Augustine, specified that control would automatically revert to Celeste or her biological child the moment that child turned 21, and that the transfer would trigger a mandatory audit of every pension fund and corporate account the company controlled. For nearly 2 decades, Desmond had built his empire on the confident assumption that Celeste was dead and no heir existed to threaten his position. He was, at that very moment, finalizing the sale of a substantial portion of the company to a foreign investment fund, a deal structured to close before Wren's birthday made his legal claim impossible to ignore. Once that sale closed, Celeste explained, the financial evidence of Desmond's fraud would be scattered across so many shell companies that even a federal investigation might never fully reconstruct it. She possessed only a copy of the trust's hidden clause, because the sole original document had been hidden by Elias Vane somewhere in Ashford Falls before his disappearance 2 decades earlier. Days before showing up at the depot, Celeste had received a recording from a lawyer representing Elias's estate, a message set to release automatically after his death. In it, Elias revealed the original document had been concealed inside something belonging to Marcus. Marcus felt the memory surface before he consciously reached for it. The image of a wooden toolbox Celeste had given him the day he opened his garage, a gift he had treasured enough to keep for 18 years without ever suspecting it held anything but wrenches and sockets. The 3 of them drove back to the shop through streets slick with rain, headlights smearing gold across the wet asphalt, none of them speaking because there seemed to be nothing left that words could accomplish. When they arrived, Marcus found the toolbox exactly where it had always sat, undisturbed in the corner of the storage room for 2 full decades, its brass latches dulled with age but still intact beneath a thin film of dust. When he pried it open, his hands were not entirely steady. What he found waiting inside was not the sealed document Celeste had described, but a room that had clearly been searched already, drawers overturned, the lock on the storage door forced open sometime before their arrival. Scrawled across the wall behind the emptied toolbox, in handwriting none of them recognized, was a single sentence meant to be read as both warning and threat. The words read simply that the dead ought to know better than to stop staying buried. Shaken but unwilling to retreat, Marcus reached out that same night to Harper Quinn, a lawyer he had trusted since their school years together, and the only person he could think of with the expertise to make sense of a trust document this complicated. She arrived at the garage still dressed from a late night at her own office, reading glasses pushed up into her hair, and listened to the entire story without once interrupting, her expression shifting slowly from polite skepticism to something closer to alarm as the pieces began to fit together in front of her. Harper confirmed the clause Celeste described could well be legally binding, but cautioned that a photocopy alone would never withstand the scrutiny of a company as well-resourced and well-lawyered as Sterling Crown Industries. She suggested bringing in Ivy, whose career as a forensic data auditor made her uniquely suited to trace the layers of shell companies Desmond had used to hide his fraud, even though the suggestion meant reopening a wound Marcus had spent years trying to protect his daughter from. Ivy arrived in Ashford Falls the following morning, fully convinced her father had fallen victim to a pair of elaborate con artists preying on an old man's unresolved grief, and she had rehearsed the entire drive down a version of the conversation where she gently but firmly talked her father back to reason. That certainty collapsed the moment she saw Celeste's face in person, recognizing in an instant the same features she had only ever known from a handful of surviving photographs kept in a drawer her father rarely opened. Photographs she used to study as a girl, trying to imagine a voice to match the smile. Something in her chest went hollow and cold, the careful speech she had prepared dissolving into nothing at all. There was no tearful reunion, no embrace between mother and daughter separated by 18 years of silence. Instead, Ivy asked her, with a controlled fury that surprised even herself, where she had been during every birthday, every graduation, every night her father worked a second job just to keep a roof over their heads. Celeste did not attempt to defend herself against the accusation. She told her simply that she was sorry, and that she understood if forgiveness was something Ivy could never offer her, no matter how much time passed or how much truth eventually came to light. Ren watched the exchange in silence, absorbing for the first time the full weight of what his own survival had actually cost someone else, a half-sister whose childhood had been shaped entirely by an absence he had never had to endure himself. Before Ivy could walk away, something about the proportions of the toolbox caught her attention. A base that sat noticeably thicker than it should have given its dimensions. Beneath a false panel at the bottom, she found a hidden compartment holding a single object, the antique pocket watch that had once belonged to Augustine Sterling himself. There was no document folded inside, no legal paper to prove anything in a courtroom. Instead, the watch's case concealed only a small brass key and a handwritten string of numbers Ivy immediately recognized as belonging to a bank account. She traced the account far enough to discover it corresponded to a safety deposit box frozen on the exact date, 18 years earlier, that Celeste was legally declared dead. Harper filed an emergency motion the following morning to force the bank to open the frozen deposit box. Word of the filing reached Desmond Sterling faster than any of them anticipated. Within hours, Sterling Crown Industries launched a coordinated media campaign painting Marcus as a man being manipulated by an imposter attempting to extort the family for money, complete with grainy photographs of Marcus and Celeste standing together at the depot, splashed across local news broadcasts. Longtime customers began canceling contracts with Marcus's garage overnight. His bank accounts came under sudden and unexplained scrutiny, and police arrived within the week to search his property based on an anonymous tip claiming he possessed documents stolen from the Sterling family. Marcus endured all of it with a grim, practiced patience, understanding by then that Desmond's reach extended into places he had never imagined a single family could touch. Desmond himself appeared at the garage not long after the police left, arriving without warning and without the security detail Marcus had expected a man of his stature to require, dressed in a coat too fine for a town like Ashford Falls, his shoes clicking against the concrete floor with an unhurried confidence that made Marcus's jaw tighten. He walked slowly among the half-finished cars, running one gloved finger along a fender as though inspecting merchandise rather than standing inside a stranger's livelihood. He made no direct threats, choosing instead a quieter and more insidious approach, offering Marcus $20 million in exchange for a signed statement declaring that the woman traveling with him was not, in fact, Celeste Sterling. Desmond reasoned aloud that Marcus owed nothing to a wife who had allowed him to believe her dead for 18 years, framing the offer as mercy rather than bribery. For one unsettling moment, standing in his own garage surrounded by the wreckage of his reputation, Marcus felt something close to temptation, though it had far less to do with the money than with a rage towards Celeste he had not yet allowed himself to fully feel. Desmond made his first true mistake in that conversation, referring to Ren by his full legal name, a name known only to Celeste, Marcus Harper, a detail that should have been impossible for him to know unless he had been tracking the young man for years. The slip told Marcus everything he needed to understand about how long Desmond had actually known of his nephew's existence, and it hardened whatever resolve had briefly wavered inside him. He refused the offer outright, and within days a discreet paternity test conducted under Harper's supervision confirmed what Marcus had already begun to accept in his heart, that Ren was his son, with a probability that left no reasonable room for doubt. Harper warned them immediately afterward that private test results, however conclusive, would never be enough on their own to sway a corporate board loyal to Desmond's version of events. That same evening, Desmond sent Ren a private message, one crafted with the precision of a man who understood exactly which doubts would cut deepest, and suggested, without offering any specifics, that his mother had never told him the full truth about the night the car went into the lake. Rattled, Ren arranged a secret meeting with Desmond at the Sterling family's downtown hotel, desperate to understand what piece of the story his mother had left incomplete. He sat across from him in a lounge decorated in muted gold and marble, acutely aware that everyone around him seemed to know exactly who Desmond was, while no one had any idea who he was. a strange and unsettling kind of invisibility for a man who had just learned he stood to inherit half of everything in the room. Desmond presented him with documents showing that Celeste had, at one point, been offered a place in a formal witness protection program, a legitimate path to safety she had ultimately declined. He used the revelation carefully, planting the idea in Ren's mind that his mother had never been purely a victim of circumstance, but a woman who had, at least in part, chosen the life of hiding that followed. When Ren confronted her about it later, Celeste didn't deny the accusation. She admitted that fear alone had not been the whole reason for her refusal, explaining that the program would have required surrendering every piece of evidence she had gathered and permanently severing her ability to shape the future of the child she was carrying. Celeste confessed she had never been entirely certain whether the official handling her case had already been compromised by Desmond's influence, suspicion that made the offered protection feel less like safety and more like another kind of trap. Marcus remained disappointed by the choice, but he found himself beginning to understand, however reluctantly, that nearly every decision Celeste had made over 18 years had been shaped by a system Desmond had already learned to bend to his will. Meanwhile, spent her nights combing through Elias Vane's old digital records and uncovered dozens of letters Celeste had written and mailed to Ashford Falls. Over the years, every one of them rerouted instead to a storage facility owned by a security firm under Sterling control. Desmond, it turned out, had been intercepting his niece's correspondence for the better part of 2 decades, ensuring not a single word of her attempted contact ever reached the family she had left behind. In the final letter Ivy recovered, dated only a week before Elias vanished, Celeste had written that she intended to come home no matter the danger it might bring. The discovery gave Ivy a version of her mother she had not expected, a woman who had genuinely tried to return long before her daughter was ready to forgive her for the years she had not. Harper, working a separate angle, tracked down the forensic pathologist who had originally signed off on the identification of the body recovered from Ashford Lake, a woman named Ruth Calloway, who had long since left the county coroner's office. Under careful questioning in a small kitchen that still smelled of the coffee she had brewed out of nervous habit, Ruth admitted the dental records used in the identification had been quietly swapped by a superior before she ever saw the original file, a confession she had carried in silence for 18 years out of fear for her own career and safety. Her hands shook slightly as she spoke, and she confessed she had thought about that file more nights than she could count, wondering whether the woman she had unknowingly helped erase was out there somewhere, still alive, still waiting for someone to tell the truth. She agreed to testify, but only if Harper could guarantee her legal protection from whatever retaliation Desmond might attempt once her statement became public. With Ruth's cooperation secured, Harper finally succeeded in forcing open the long-frozen safety deposit box tied to the numbers hidden inside Augustine Sterling's pocket watch. Instead of the original trust document they had all hoped to find, the box contained nothing but an empty envelope and a single photograph, one showing Victor Lane, the company's longtime chief financial officer, removing something from that very same box a full decade earlier. With Ren's birthday now less than a day away, Desmond convened an emergency meeting of the company's board of directors, determined to push the foreign investment sale through before midnight stripped him of the authority to approve it alone. Marcus, Celeste, Ren, Ivy, and Harper arrived together at the towering Sterling Crown headquarters, its glass facade catching the last orange light of evening, only to be stopped at the lobby entrance because Celeste remained, on every official record, a woman who had been legally dead for 18 years. Security guards in dark suits formed a quiet wall in front of the elevators, polite but immovable. For several tense minutes, it seemed the entire confrontation might end there in a marble lobby before it had even properly begun. Harper fought to secure entry using Ruth Calloway's sworn statement as leverage, demanding the board delay any vote until the question of Celeste's identity could be formally addressed. Desmond met them in the lobby himself, visibly amused, mocking Marcus in front of several arriving board members as nothing more than a small-town mechanic whose greed had finally gotten the better of him. It was Victor Lane, arriving unannounced and clearly agitated, who changed the direction of the entire confrontation. He confirmed, without being asked, that he had indeed removed documents from the safety deposit box exactly 10 years earlier, a fact everyone in the room initially assumed would only strengthen Desmond's position. Instead, Victor revealed that Elias Vane himself had asked him to safeguard the original trust document years before his disappearance, fearing correctly that even a bank vault would not remain safe from Desmond's reach forever. Victor admitted he had stayed silent for a decade only because Desmond had threatened to pin the company's entire pattern of financial fraud squarely on him if he ever spoke a word of what he knew. What finally broke his silence was the realization that Desmond intended to liquidate the very pension fund thousands of ordinary employees depended on. A betrayal Victor found he could no longer carry alone. He had spent 30 years climbing the company's ranks, had trained himself to look the other way through smaller compromises he told himself didn't matter, but he found he could not stand in a room and watch factory workers and receptionists lose their retirements to fund a stranger's yacht in a private island somewhere off a coast he could barely name. He produced the original trust document on the spot, along with independently verified copies of the paternity results, Ruth Calloway's signed statement, and the intercepted letters Ivy had painstakingly traced back to Sterling-owned storage facilities. The papers were spread across the long mahogany table one by one, each document landing with a quiet finality that seemed to hush the entire room. And several board members who had spent years nodding along to Desmond's decisions now sat in visible discomfort, unable to meet his eyes. The evidence left no room for doubt, confirming both that Celeste Sterling Cole was alive and that Wren stood as the legitimate heir to a controlling interest in the company his grandfather had built. Desmond made one final desperate attempt to force the foreign sale through before the clock struck midnight, but the moment Wren's birthday arrived, his temporary authority over the disputed shares was automatically suspended by the very clause he had spent nearly 2 decades believing no longer existed. Wren now held the deciding voice over 51% of Sterling Crown Industries, a fact that visibly unsettled Desmond more than any accusation leveled against him that night, because he clearly expected retribution equal to everything he had taken from her family. Standing before the seat that had once belonged to his grandfather, Wren made his first decision as the company's newly recognized controlling shareholder. He did not choose to remove Desmond from the board out of vengeance. Instead, he ordered the company's entire financial history opened without restriction to federal investigators. Desmond Sterling was suspended from his position within days, facing formal charges of fraud, document forgery, and obstruction of a federal investigation. His empire dismantled not through any dramatic act of revenge, but through the quiet weight of paperwork he had spent 2 decades believing was permanently under his control. Celeste refused every suggestion that she step into the role of chief executive herself, choosing instead to hand day-to-day authority to an independent oversight board, while insisting, as her first and only non-negotiable condition, that the depleted pension fund be restored to every employee it had once belonged to. Wren, for his part, wanted no part of a life defined entirely by inherited wealth and corporate obligation. He agreed to retain his voting authority but chose to remain focused on finishing his education, involving himself only in the company's most significant ethical decisions rather than its daily operations. Ivy was not yet ready to call Celeste her mother, and she made no pretense otherwise. But she agreed to let her write to her again, this time using a real address with no intermediary standing between them, and she found herself, against her own expectations, checking the mailbox a little more eagerly than she would have admitted to anyone. Wren asked his father, quietly and without any real expectation, whether he wanted to run the paternity test a second time now that the truth carried no legal urgency behind it. Marcus told him he didn't need another piece of paper to confirm what he'd already understood the moment he first saw his eyes at the bus depot. Celeste asked Marcus for a chance to begin again, though she asked it carefully, without any assumption that the years lost between them could simply be waved away by good intentions. Marcus didn't slide his wedding ring back onto his finger that night, and he didn't pretend 18 years of grief and silence could be forgiven in a single conversation. He told her plainly that the marriage they once shared had ended the day the world declared her dead. Whatever came next between them would have to be something new, built honestly from the ground up rather than salvaged from what had been lost. Celeste accepted that condition without argument, and for a moment something in her posture eased, as though she had been braced for a harsher answer than the one he'd given. She asked, almost tentatively, whether she might come back to the garage the following morning. Marcus considered the question for a long moment before answering. Tomorrow, he told her, sounded like a reasonable place to start. A year passed before Ashford Falls truly settled back into something resembling ordinary life, though nothing about it felt quite the same as before. Cole Restoration reopened under a freshly painted sign, but Marcus kept the old wooden toolbox exactly where it had always sat in the corner of his office, a reminder he had no interest in packing away. Sterling Crown Industries entered a long and painful process of restructuring under new oversight, its pension fund gradually restored to the employees who had been quietly robbed of it, while Desmond awaited trial as former allies within his own network chose cooperation with prosecutors over continued loyalty to a man whose empire had already collapsed. Ivy began having dinner with Celeste every few weeks, cautious and imperfect, the two of them relearning each other slowly rather than pretending 18 years apart could be erased through effort alone. Wren spent his school breaks working part-time at the garage, admitting freely that he had little natural talent for engine repair, often leaving smudges of grease on his jeans that never quite washed out, though he discovered, almost by accident, that he could recognize a faulty engine sound with the same instinctive ear his father possessed. Celeste and Marcus had not remarried, choosing instead to date cautiously, arguing sometimes over small things, relearning each other's habits and history without flinching away from the parts of the past that still ached. On a quiet afternoon many months later, with autumn light slanting low through the open bay doors and the radio humming an old song neither of them bothered to name, Marcus stood beside Wren, in front of a fully restored Camaro gleaming under the shop's fluorescent lights, its work finally complete after months of careful attention. The car's paint caught the light the way it had the day Celeste first gave him the toolbox, a coincidence Marcus chose to notice rather than dismiss. Wren caught his reflection in the rearview mirror, and for the very first time since the day they met at that rain-soaked bus depot, called him something other than a stranger who happened to share his face. He called him Dad. Marcus didn't answer right away. He set down the wrench in his hand, wiped his palms slowly against a rag that had been his own father's before it was his, and let the moment settle over him the way sunlight settles over a room after a long storm finally passes. He only smiled, watching the pale green eyes that had once dragged his entire past back into the present, eyes that were no longer a reminder of everything he had lost, but a quiet promise of everything still ahead. The end.